So I just got back from a 10,000 kilometer journey through the Simo, through the Tanami, through the Gib, and then all the way back to Queensland. The cruiser's all detailed inside and out, and as I'm about to put it up onto the hoist, I found this. Yep, that's a little wet spot on the concrete. Don't know whether the video can pick it, but that is red in color. So we either have ATF or power steering fluid. Time to get her up on the hoist and check it out. You want to find out what I found and how I'm going to deal with it? Stick around. There is the pan on our automatic transmission, and there is no leak coming from that sucker anywhere. There's a little bit of wetness here. There's a drip right there ready to let go. That's one end of the front diff housing. There's the coupler for the steering wheel. It runs down in that direction. There's the input seal to the rack, and that is where it's leaking. It's not leaking a lot because I haven't had to top up the power steering reservoir, but as you can see, it only takes a cap full of fluid. It spreads like crazy and sticks like shit to a blanket. So I'm either up for a new power steering rack or replacing that seal. We'll have to do a little bit of research and determine whether that seal can be replaced, but I got a sneaking suspicion it's a new rack. Just to confirm that that's exactly where it's leaking from, I'm going to get some carby cleaner, clean up this entire area. I'll drive around for 50K or so, and I'll recheck that area and see whether that is indeed where it's coming out, but I think I'm onto it. Okay, I got this entire area cleaned down with carby cleaner. Specifically, I've got that suspect location on the steering rack all cleaned down. So now I'll put some Ks on the car and I'll recheck that in a few days' time and have a look at what we've got. Well, I went for a drive of about 20 kilometers. That didn't take long, did it? Looking up inside there, that power steering rack is definitely leaking. And it's leaking right where I thought it was. So what does that actually mean for me? I've got a few choices here. I can leave it and just let the thing keep leaking and just keep topping it up. But that's not the way that I roll. I'm not going to do that. So my two choices after that are replace the seals or replace the rack. Whatever way I go, that rack has got to come out of the car. Now, I've heard horror stories about you having to pull the motor out or having to drop the diff to get the thing out. Fingers crossed I can get that rack out without having to do either of that. I'll probably have to loosen the front diff, and I may have to loosen the engine mounts as well. But by the end of this video, you'll know what I had to do to get that rack out. So that's a given, the rack's got to come out. Now I got two choices to repair that. One, I get myself a seal kit from Toyota, which is around about the $60 mark. Two, I get a brand new rack, and I haven't got that completely priced yet, but I'm guessing it's somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000. So which way do I go? Obviously throwing new seals at it is the much cheaper option. But you know what? I think I'm actually going to replace the rack. It's got 260,000 kilometers on it now. I'd hate to go to all this trouble, replace those seals, and then find somewhere else on the unit it starts to leak. Because not only are there seals in the spots where mine is leaking, but there's also seals in either end of the rack. So far they haven't let go, but after 250,000 kilometers, do they let go at 251? Do they let go at 400,000? Do they let go at 1 million? I don't know, but I don't think I want to take that chance. So I'm going to stump up the big bickies, get a new steering rack, and install that. And that's what this video is all about. Let's get stuck into it. All right, 1 week and $1,500 later, and this is what we got. There is our part number, 44200-60140. Link Assembly Power. Let's open up the box and see what we got. There she is, the big rack attack. And I love big racks. All right, what do we got here? There's a seal inside of there, and that is the sucker that is leaking on my unit. You get both tie rod ends, that's cool. You get all three of the mounting bushes, that's awesome. And that's about it. On the really early 200 series,
these here failed. What would happen is these pipes would vibrate, and they'd vibrate to the point where it actually snapped this banjo off. When I pull my old rack off, I'll show you what I've done to prevent that, and I haven't had any leaks over 270,000 kilometers and at least 1 million corrugations. Yeah, but if you've got a really early model like an 08, that is where these suckers can sometimes fail. All right, let me start with the easy job, which is breaking these KDSS shutter valves. 1, 2, 3 turns. If you're wondering what that is, no, it's not a funky muffler. It's my air tank. And if you remove your muffler, you've got room to put that air tank there. 1, 2, 3. Now I'm going to use my Succulator 3000 to evacuate as much of the power steering fluid out of this reservoir as I can. Okay, now I'll knock the 2 front tires off. All right, I'm over on the left side of the vehicle. This little plastic shield needs to come off because this is the side of the vehicle the rack comes out of. Now we'll pull this cotter key out of here because these tie rod ends need to come off as well. Doesn't matter if I damaged the end of that because obviously that's all getting replaced. All right, one of the rack bolts is behind this little bash cover. You can see that I've got spacers in mine because I've got a diff drop kit. But if you don't have a diff drop kit, you still got to take this off. And there's the rack bolt there. You can see once you get those covers off, you can get to these bolts now that actually hold the rack in. Now, because I've got to get up there to get to the actual bolt that holds the rack onto the steering shaft, I'm going to pull this lowering bracket off of the diff to give me some clearance to get in there, Clarence. That's a big one, that's 22 mil. Oh yeah, need the bigger ugga-dugga. Okay, try that again. That's better. Well, at least this leaky power steering pump has kept all these bolts nice and lubed up. Got him. Now there are 2 brackets that hold this hose assembly in place. One of them is here. That's got to come off. And the other one is just up in there. All right, those 2 12 mil bolts are out, so those lines can flap in the breeze now. Now, up in there, you see those 2 lines? The ones you want to get to are way up there on top of the diff, but you can't get to them. They're way up there, over on the other side of the diff on the rack, but you can't get to them, at least I can't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo the 3 bolts holding the rack in place, allow me to twist and shift that rack, and then maybe I can get to those lines. However, before I do that, I'm going to undo that steering coupler while the rack is sitting in situ. There's not a whole lot of room in there to wiggle around, but you can get it. Okay, see if I can knock this coupler off. Oh yeah, she's coming. Nice, Gary. Okay, let's see if my little Ryobi Ugga-Dugga can undo these nuts. Nope. Need a breaker bar. Holy moly. Those bolts are tight. I got a massive bloody bar on here. It's coming, but holy moly. I got a massive bar here for a bit of leverage. And I have got one off using this, so that's a start. That one moved. Wowzers. Got him. Now that's a bolt.
Not many bolts you need a 1.5 meter long breaker bar to get off.
Okay, well, I've got the 3 bolts holding the rack on now. I was able to shift the rack a little bit, which allowed me to get into this little peephole and get at least one of the lines off. And I think this one's the low pressure line because it's just got a rubber hose clamp on it. And I think the high pressure side, I wouldn't imagine they'd have any hose clamps. It would be all crimp connectors. I got myself a drain bucket sitting underneath for when this thing starts spewing blood everywhere. Just preliminarily looking at it as I've been shifting the rack a little bit to and fro, it does look like our engine is in the road. So I haven't crossed that bridge yet, but I'm not looking forward to it. Hear that? That's blood dripping. And it's not mine for once. Got one line off. We'll just let that completely drain out of there before I get in there. All right, I pulled those 2 lines off and I've shifted the steering box as far as I could towards the left-hand side of the vehicle. And it's definitely fouling the motor. It's not a lot, but it's enough to prevent it from pulling through. It won't come out on the end on this right-hand side. You just don't have enough pivot to be able to get the steering box part of the rack around this corner. So it's definitely got to come out this left-hand side, but that motor definitely has to shift up as well. Now, before I go digging into bolts on motor mounts, I'm just going to see whether I can jack that motor up on the mounts enough to allow me to get the clearance on the steering box that I need. Earlier, I opened up the shutter valves on the KDSS, and the reason I did that was I thought I was going to have to pull the sway bar out of the road. But you can actually get your hand up and get to these lines without pulling that sway bar off. So don't worry about doing that step. I'm glad I didn't drop it. So for my first attempt, I'll put a block of timber here on the bottom of the engine, jack it up, and see whether I get enough clearance to get that rack out. There's 2 limiting factors. One, will the motor mounts even allow the vehicle to be jacked up or not? I don't know. And the second one is I've only got about 1 inch of clearance between the fan blades and the fan shroud. So if those mounts do allow me to jack it up and this 1 inch of clearance isn't enough, then I'm gonna have to take that fan blade off, which is no big deal. There's only 4 bolts holding it on. But let's give this a crack first. I always like to try and take the easiest way out if I can. But who am I kidding? I know this isn't gonna work. Let's go. That's it. That's as far as I'm gonna get it on those mounts. And that wasn't very far. Let me see if I can move this rack at all. Well, it's better, but no chance. It's still fouling. It's clear on this section of the rack now, but over here, behind here, where the actual steering gear is, no chance whatsoever. So, looks like I gotta undo the engine mounts. Well, in a positive bit of news, in a small way anyway, there's the engine mount bolts. There's one there, and there's another one there, and I can see the 2 on the other side of the car as well. So there's a reasonable chance I can get to these and get them cracked. These 2 plastic shields need to come off first. Hello, engine mount bolt. Hello, front engine mount bolt. I might have to take this remote reservoir out of there as well. All right, those engine mount bolts are 14 millimeter. And I can actually loosen it with a spanner without having to double them up. You know, stack the one spanner on top of the other spanner. Sweet. All right, I'll report back once I get my 4 bolts done on my engine mounts, 2 per side. All right, I pulled that engine mount bolt out just to show you. I'd call that about 50 mil long. You can see that bolt in there. I haven't pulled that all the way out, and I'm not going to either. And the one I just showed you, I'm gonna run back in a few threads. And the reason for that is I think I only need about 25 mil to get that rack out of there. And if this engine was to shift back or sideways or whatever, and those bolt holes weren't lined up anymore, I don't know how you'd line those bastards back up again. So for that reason, I'm backing these bolts off about 25 mil and see whether it gives me enough clearance. Over on the left-hand side of the vehicle, it's a lot nastier. You gotta get that cover out of the road. There's a cover that sits over there. That's it on the floor. Then if you're equipped with KDSS, this little bracket sits here to hold these KDSS lines. You got to take that bracket off, and then you can get back into that bolt. The back bolt is above the brake line and below those KDSS lines. I don't even know how I'm going to get that sucker out of there, but I'll start by loosening off this brake line here. Maybe that'll give me enough wiggle room to get in there. I got my big ass fan fanning. It's going up to 35 degrees today, and hot temperatures and unwilling bolts, not a good combination. All right, as you can see by that crusty rack on the left-hand side, I got it out of the car. And that was not easy. I am not going to fool anybody. I'm just taking off this little mounting tab here off the original one because that interferes with getting this thing back in. All right, let me take you to the underside of the car and I'll show you what I had to do. I didn't video it at the time because my battery went flat and I was just too angry to replace the battery. But I've taken the diff off completely. So there's 3 mountings on the pumpkin and there's 1 mounting here on the end, which I took off earlier. All of those had to come off. So the diff's just sort of swinging in the breeze at the moment, and I've got a ratchet strap pulling it backwards. The reason for that is I needed to open up this space to be able to slide the rack through. The other thing that I did, and I showed that earlier, was I've loosened off the engine mounts and I got a block of timber and I've jacked the engine up. Not far, about 25, 35 mil is all it took. And I'm over here on the left-hand side of the vehicle, and that's the hole that I slid the rack out of. Now I'm gonna try and get it back in there. You would think if I got it out, I should be able to get it back in. Regardless of what I do, it's not gonna be fun. It's 35 degrees out in the shed at the moment, and my patience level when it gets this hot is not that great. So bear with me. I mentioned earlier in the video that on the really early racks, like the 07, 08s, this tended to fail. You would get some harmonics, it would vibrate and wobble, and it would snap off at that banjo. And when that happens, the game's over. There's no bush fix for that. So what I did to prevent that was I just got a couple of bits of rubber, jammed it in here, and then put a zip tie around here, just to stop those harmonics. And you only need to do that if you really do a lot of off-road work with your car, especially across corrugations where this thing can get up that sort of a wobble and a harmonic. Because I do a significant amount of off-road work, I'm going to do that again on this rack. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this line off because that's just going to interfere with me trying to get this rack back in there. Now I know I'm going to be up for a front end alignment on this thing because the toe end's going to be all out of whack, but I'll try and get the new rack as close to the old as possible. So that's about 280 from the boot to the joint, and on the new rack it's exactly the same. That's excellent. Yep, the other end is 280 as well. And if I measure from the start of the boot here out to our joint, it's around about 470. Measure the same distance on this one. That one is also about 470. So what that tells me is that rack is pretty close to center left to right, which is where my old one was when I pulled it out. So I've marked myself a little dot here, because if I have to spin this rack at all to bring this in to help facilitate installation, I know the position to wind it back out again to get it close to center. Okay, baby, be good to me, please. Get in there. It's just fouling on those 2 lines. So I'm gonna pull those off the rack and hopefully that'll get me in. I did have to pull these 2 lines off of the old rack to get it out. So it makes sense that I gotta pull them off to get it in. To do that, just 2 compression fittings on that end, and the banjo bolt here, and there's 2 washers on this banjo bolt. If you've got pipe spanners, these are the way to go. Okay, let's see how we go now. Put a bit of tape over top of those 2 holes, just so I don't get shit in there. That's it, she's in. Excellent. That makes me feel a whole lot better. All right, I got my lines affixed. The banjo bolts are in. The hard lines are in on the steering box end. I think we're now ready to start running some mounting bolts into that rack and putting it in place before I drop this engine down. 1 big ass bolt and a nut and a washer up on the top side. All right, I'll rinse and repeat that for that back mount and the other mount on the other side, and I think I can drop the motor down. Okay, we're in good shape. Let's drop this motor nice and slow. There we have it. All right, now I'm gonna put these 2 bits of rubber in behind this one line, just like that. And we'll whack a zip tie around it. There we go. That takes all the harmonics completely out of that hard line, so she doesn't wobble and flap in the breeze when we're going over those corrugations. All right, moving on, I'll attach this line. Just got those two 12mm bolts that bolt onto the rack itself. All right, I got my lines now hooked up to the top of the box. That wasn't easy. There's not a lot of room to work in there, but we got it. Now I've got my steering clocked all the way to the left, and I needed to do that, so this was the short end, and it allowed me to get the steering rack in. So now I'm gonna center the wheel, and then I'll hook that steering coupler up. All right, I've clocked that around to the spot that it needs to be. There it goes. All right, I got my 12mm bolt run down on that steering coupler. Next thing I'm going to do is run these 4 bolts down that hold the motor mounts in. Now, I'm not going to film this because literally this takes about 15 minutes per bolt, because you can get about a quarter turn on these suckers. So I got them lubed up with a bit of WD-40. I'm going to run them down and we'll check back in probably an hour. All right, it is literally an hour later. I've got those 4 engine bolts done up. Now, before I go ahead and put any more bolts in it, like the diff bolts and any of the guards that go onto the inner wheel housing or any of that stuff, I'm going to fill this up with fluid. I'm going to fire it up and I'm going to see whether I've got any leaks. Because if I've got leaks, I want to deal with them now, not after I put everything back in place again. You see, I filled that up very much past the full spot. Obviously, as soon as the power steering pump starts and I start turning the wheel, it's going to draw that fluid down, and I'll just need to keep topping it up. But as you can see, I haven't got my tie rods hooked up. I don't have any of these inner guards hooked up. I'm not counting those chickens until they're hatched. Work the wheel back and forth, get that fluid flowing through that power steering system, trying not to hit the stops where the overpressure is. Okay, we can see that that power steering fluid is all bubbly and fuzzy and foamy. So I'm going to shut the car down, let that sit for a while, let those bubbles sort of get out of there. And then I'm going to climb under the car and see whether I got any leaks. Okay, I've run the car. I had a little bit of redness down here, but I think it was the reservoir overflowing, the bubbles sort of bubbling out through the reservoir and overflowing. I've sprayed it all down with Carby cleaner. I started the car up again, and I can't see any weeping anywhere, so I'm pretty sure it was coming from that reservoir. So, jobs left to do. Put the diff back in place and do up all of these side covers. And then I'm going to have to do a wheel alignment by string. And I'll just need to do that so that I can get to a tire shop and get it done properly. But you can see if that tie rod is put in there, that wheel is actually facing out. So I'm going to have to bring that inboard a little bit. I'll put about 2 or maybe 3 mil of toe in on this thing. That'll be good enough for the 20-minute drive to the tire shop, and then they can do it properly. Righty, let's get this diff put back in, shall we? I'm not sure I'm going to have enough throw on my jack. I might need a different block of timber. All right, let's see how far this gets us up. Getting pretty close. There's the sweet spot. All right, this back mount has got 3 points on it. It's got 1 bolt here on a rubber stopper that sits on the tail of the diff, and then 2 other mounting points. 1 here, 1 there. Now I'll drop this jack because there's 1 bolt that I've got to get to, and the jack's in the road. Well, look at that. The diff stayed put. Sweet. Got him. Last two bolts are these two on the end of the bracket. Remember earlier I was talking about doubling up spanners? This is what I meant, to get a little bit extra leverage. You can't really get a rattle gun or a socket in there, so you link a spanner on the end of a spanner, and there's your leverage. This top bolt, you get a whole quarter turn to go. That's got us. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Diff pumpkin, 5, 6, 7. Diff is done. Okay, now to put on this diff bolt bash cover. I just got a bit of motor assembly grease on the threads of these bolts. Okay, rinse and repeat on the other side. Done. All right, the last step I've got to do is obviously fit the bash plates. Now I'm not going to do that. I'm going to drive around for a couple of days just to make sure I don't have any leaks before I put those bash plates in place. The next thing I'm going to do is a string line wheel alignment. Let's check that out. All right, I got the jam nut on the tie rod end loosened off. And the way that you adjust your toe in on these things is you simply do that. Pulling it one way brings the front of the tire in, and in the opposite direction pushes the front of the tire out. All right, let me get my string line. I'm setting the car down on a couple of wheel dollies, and that'll just allow the front tires to rotate when I'm adjusting on those tie rods. But I gotta put weight on the front of the car. You can't do this with the car in the air. All right, that's it, she's on the ground. All right, I got my string line running parallel with the car. Oh, no way. Just about to do the string line wheel alignment, and I found a bolt in the tire. I hope that only goes into the tread block and doesn't go into the tire itself. Looks like it might be a tech screw. All right, I'll come back to that later. That is 45 mil to the back edge of the back rim, and that's 50 mil to the front edge of the back rim. So I'll pull this back edge out a little bit, and I'll push that front edge in a little bit. All right, that string line now is roughly parallel. 64 mil from the front edge of the rim to the string, and from the back edge of the rim to the string. Of course, this is assuming that that diff is sitting square and that that tire is square on the hub. Now I'm up here at the front tire. Let's see what we've got. Now I'm not looking for 64 mil. I'm simply looking for a measurement that compares the back of the rim to the front of the rim. That's about 56 mil, and that is about 42 mil. So the front of the tire needs to go in. So the difference between the front of the tire and the rear was about 8 mil. So I've moved that jam nut so that I've got an 8 mil gap there. And now I'll just take this and I'll rotate it and I'll close that gap up. All right, that gap is closed up on that jam nut. Let's measure our toe in. Okay, on the back edge of the rim here, I've got 46 mil. And on the front edge of the rim, I have 50 mil. So that means I've got 4 millimeters of toe in across the distance of that rim. I think I'll back that off to about 3 millimeters. All right, that's 47 mil. That one's 50 mil. There's 3 millimeters of toe in. Now, I wouldn't be doing this if I was traveling around a lap of the country, but to get from here to a tire shop, which is about 20 minutes away, that toe in is going to do me just fine. Okay, I'll tighten up that jam nut. All right, jam nut tight. We'll just double check that measurement. Back edge 46, front edge 49.5. That'll do us. Okay, I'll rinse and repeat on the other side, do up those shutter valves on the KDSS system, and call this job done. So what's my conclusion on this job? Listen, it's a little bit of a bitch, especially undoing those engine mounts, trying to get in there and turning those one side of the hex for every spanner flip. That was a bit of a ball ache. Other than that, the little bit of finagling that you got to do, it wasn't too bad. Do I want to do it again? Absolutely not, and that's why I put a new rack in there and just didn't replace that one seal, just in case other seals decide to go at some point in the future. Check out the 200 series playlist. Lots of how-tos in there. We'll catch you next time. Keep the shiny side up. Bye now.